Hello, my name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson Graff, and I'm the rabbi here at Port Jewish Center in Port Washington, New York. And we're thrilled to welcome you here today to our conversation with Professor Ken Wald. We're also thrilled to welcome some friends from other congregations around the East Coast, Congregation Shaarei Tzedek in East Lansing, Michigan, Temple Bat Yam in Berlin, Maryland, Temple Concord in Binghamton, New York, Temple Bethel and Temple Israel in Ormond Beach, Florida, and Vassar Temple in Poughkeepsie, New York. And we're also thrilled to welcome some friends who live in the mountains of Colorado, Aspen Jewish Congregation. Welcome to all of you. If there was ever a day to hear from Professor Ken Wald, it's probably today, the day after one of the most interesting days in American history, January 6, 2021. A little background on our speaker. Ken Wald is a native of Nebraska, and he spent 4 decades teaching political science. He's a pioneer in developing the study of religion in modern political life. He wrote what became the major textbook of the field, now in its 8th edition. He developed some of the first specialized courses on the subject, published path-breaking articles in academic journals, and mentored numerous students who have carried on research in the field. He has also co-founded the Religion and Politics section of the American Political Science Association and a flourishing book series on religion and politics for the Cambridge University Press. Most of his career was spent at the University of Florida, go Gators, but he was and remains a visiting faculty member at many schools in the United States and around the world. In 2018, he was the Halsworth Visiting Professor at the University of Manchester in England, where he taught master classes on religion and politics. This followed visiting appointments at Harvard University, the University of Michigan, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Haifa University, the University of Toronto, Linnaeus University in Sweden, and the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. He has also lectured by invitation in China, Burkina Faso, Spain, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Israel, and the Chautauqua Institution in upstate New York. The University of Florida named Wald its Teacher Scholar of the Year in 2011, the highest award for a faculty member. Although he has received other teaching awards, Wald says he cherishes most other testaments to his impact on students, and 2 of his former students even asked him to perform his weddings. He is also very proud that his co-authors on the next edition of his Religion and Politics text were his students. The book that he has written, Foundation of American Jewish Liberalism, received a Jewish Book Council Award, and it is what brings him to us today. I am thrilled to welcome Professor Ken Wald.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi, for the introduction. I was thinking this morning, I went back and looked at a lecture I gave in 4 years ago, almost to the day, in 2017, at a university in Sweden, where I had a former postdoc who had invited me over to lecture. And it was to explain about the Swedes, the American electoral system, and in particular, the likely, what was going to happen under the Trump administration. And the last note I had on my PowerPoint was that we're going to have 4 years of government by tantrum. I wish I had been wrong. In some senses, I was even a little more optimistic than that sounds. But yeah, it's been quite a day, and I wondered at some point if I had to just get rid of the talk I was going to give and talk about what happened yesterday. But I think it's better just to sort of give you an overview of the book I read, because it does tie in certain ways with what happened yesterday. And then I'll try to keep this relatively short as an academic can. And then we'll hopefully have plenty of time for conversations. So let me start with explanation about why I wrote a book about the foundations of American Jewish liberalism. American Jews are politically puzzling, and the puzzle stems from the fact that for almost a century now, American Jews have been overwhelmingly democratic in their partisanship and massively liberal in their policy preferences. We know that from surveys where we ask them for their partisanship and their ideological self-definition, but we also know it from their behavior, whether you look at how they vote, to whom they make their financial contributions, and with whom they engage in partisan activity, it is clear that American Jews are massively disproportionately democratic. There is some nuance that, if time permitted, I would discuss, but I think because I'd like to get through the overview fairly quickly, I'll save that for the discussion section. Now, what attracted me, as I said, were puzzles about that reality I've just described. And the first puzzle is simply that American Jews are very different politically from other Americans with whom they resemble. Americans of equivalent socioeconomic status, education, urban residence, and the like are much more likely than Jews to be Republicans and to hold conservative political positions. And American Jews, in fact, vote much more like racial and ethnic minorities than they do like people who resemble them in terms of social resources. That led Milton Himmelfarb to make the famous politically incorrect comment that American Jews earn like Episcopalians but vote like Puerto Ricans. And I should point out that remains empirically true. It's still a fact in the modern period. But that's not the only puzzle. American Jews differ not just from other Americans who they resemble, they also differ from Jews elsewhere in other countries who are, for the most part, either center-right or right-wing. American Jews are, in fact, the only diaspora community for whom we have data, most of whose members are on the left side of their country's political spectrum. They stand out in that respect as well. And finally, American Jews are also different from the other American voting groups with whom they once formed what was called the New Deal or the Roosevelt Coalition, that group of voters who brought the Democrats victory in most elections from 1932 until the 1970s. Of that coalition, white Anglo-Catholics, by which I mostly mean European Catholics, white Southerners, and labor union members who had been part of that coalition, along with Jews, began to drift away from the Democrats in the 1970s and 80s. But those three groups, unlike Jews, have continued to be much less democratic than they used to be, while Jews have swung back heavily toward the Democratic Party, starting actually in the late 1980s. So Jews are different than other Americans who they resemble. They're different from other Jews in other countries, and they're different from voter groups with whom they used to share a particular pattern. And what all this tells me is that in understanding the political behavior of American Jews today, we need to focus on them as American Jews, not as American Jews. His scholars have tried to explain American Jews' political behavior by focusing on what I call Judaic factors. And my argument is it's not really Judaic factors, it's the American context that has made American Jews so politically distinctive. The book, which I published in 2018, and which was fortunate enough to win the National Jewish Book Award, one of them last year, argues that American Jews developed a distinctive political culture, a basic set of political views and perceptions that is based on classic liberal values. This perspective, this political culture, began to develop even in the late 18th century when the United States was first created as a nation, and was pretty much fully developed by the late 19th century. So it's got a venerable history. And as I said, this political culture is organized around some core assumptions of classic liberalism. The first of these is that the state, referring to government generally, has no religious identity. America is in no legal sense a Christian nation or a Christian state. As a state, it is simply incompetent in matters of religion. And that's important because this was one of the very first places where Jews lived where the state was not defined in religious terms. And that made an enormous amount of difference for the Jewish experience. Jews became, at the outset of the founding, full citizens of the United States with rights that were guaranteed by law. Elsewhere, they were often denied citizenship or treated as second-class citizens whose rights depended on tolerance. That is, they were allowed certain things, whereas in the US, the rights were guaranteed by law, which again produced a very different political system. American Jews, as part of this doctrine, this political culture, perceived the state as secular in nature. There were two realms, the secular and the religious. The state was confined to the secular, and religion was treated as essentially a private organization which existed outside of the government realm. The core notion of a secular state is that it allocates neither benefits nor imposes costs based on religion. And together, these qualities made up what I've called a regime of religion and state, in which Jews had a very favorable position, much more favorable than they enjoyed in virtually any other country on the planet, and certainly any of the places they had lived before. And I also demonstrate in the book that the preservation of this system, this political culture and this secular state, became the political priority for American Jewry very early in American history. Now, it is very important to understand that Jews were liberals in the classic sense I've just described long before they became Democrats. American Jews, like most voter groups, switched between parties over time. And as I noted before, it wasn't until the late 1920s and early 30s that they really cast their lot politically with the Democratic Party. Prior to that time, Jews would work with any political party when they had a concern about issues on the agenda that affected their rights, whether it was discrimination against Jews in various institutions, whether it was the use of Christian prayer in public schools, whether it was when seeking allies to help Jews abroad who were suffering from discrimination, like the Jews in Russia and Romania and elsewhere. American Jews would work with any political party. And the reason for that is fairly simple. Neither of the major political parties in the United States was polarized based on this regime of religion and state. Both parties largely shared the views that Jews shared at this time about the state being secular in nature. So Jews were not reluctant to work with the Republicans if the Republicans were in power or in a place where they had issues, and they were not reluctant to work with Democrats either, because again, questions of religion and state simply didn't divide the parties. When Jews became Democrats in the late 1920s and early 30s, it was because of the Depression, and in particular, because the Democratic Party embraced the idea of a social welfare state to address the economic and social problems that the Depression had brought into place. In part, this was because many of those policies were actually designed by Jewish social workers and Jewish politicians, and most of them had been initially developed in New York State under the administrations of Governor Al Smith and Governor Franklin Roosevelt. So Jews fairly naturally gravitated to a party which, unlike the Republicans, believed that the state had a positive responsibility to address social inequality, poverty, and so forth, and unemployment. Again, it was not classic liberalism which divided the parties at this time. That only really began in the 1990s when Americans began to divide over the proper role of religion and state. This actually began to develop in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but it really flowered by the 1990s. And the reason for that was simply that the Republican Party chose to change its electoral base after its disastrous defeats due to the Watergate crisis in 1974. And they followed the advice of Kevin Phillips and identified a new constituency that had previously been mostly Democratic that they felt could help it win elections. That was a constituency defined largely as conservative Catholics and, most importantly, white evangelical Protestants. And by now, white evangelicals have become the core of the Republican Party, the base of the constituency. They were also the key factor in the rise of the Tea Party movement before Donald Trump. And if you watched some of the footage yesterday, both inside and outside the Capitol, you will have seen a flag that is informally considered the Christian flag, developed by people on the religious right, the so-called Christian right. The Republican Party, not surprisingly, has therefore become the party of Christian nationalism today. And American Jews perceived this broad movement of Christian conservatism as a threat to their status in the United States. And not surprisingly, they saw the Democratic Party as more committed to maintaining the idea of a secular state than was true of the Republicans. So that, in as short a time as any academic can summarize a long book, is the argument I make in the Foundation's book. So hopefully we can explore some of these things in chat in the question session. Okay, so back to you, Rabbi.
So am I showing the slides?
Well, I think you should perhaps identify the questions for me, or.
Oh, so you want people to,
yeah.
So we'll go to, okay, so
Yeah.
let me just change the view so that I can
Okay.
see everybody. Okay, so
Okay.
do you want me
Yeah.
to open it to questions?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
And you can open the slides and I'll tell you which, if it becomes appropriate.
Oh, okay, great, gotcha. Okay, so and I just, again, I will make sure to put a link to Professor Wald's book, Foundations of American Jewish Liberalism, so that you can just click right on it. Of course, if you have a local bookstore, we always prefer that you try to order it through them. But we know that, we are living in a pandemic, and so you get it how you can. I know there are a few people in my congregation who got it and have been reading it and really fascinated by it. That being said, I'm opening it to questions. So if you have a question, you can either, if you know how to raise your hand, like electronically, or if you want to just put a hand up, I can ask you to do that. I'm going to start with Mark Marcellus.
Hello, and thanks for doing this. So I'd like to ask a little bit about the distinction of Jews being more liberal in America than elsewhere, because, especially since the Bolshevik Revolution, Jews worldwide have been associated with that whole movement in this country and often demonized as part of it. So, for example, in Germany, Hitler identified Jews with communism and so on. And I'm just wondering, since you're saying that the basic political nature is different, was that just a matter of politicians finding a convenient villain, or why is that different than what was going on here?
Well, what I think I want to focus on is how American Jews engage the political system. And again, what I want to stress is that conditions in the United States enable Jews to be involved in public life and to be far more effective than they would have been in other societies. Their constitutional rights were important. Their ability to organize and engage in public life was also very different. There is no question that, of course, Jews were perceived internationally by right-wing politicians as pillars of the political left. And indeed, they were disproportionately involved in the left side of the political spectrum in most countries. Jews were, of course, one of the pillars of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. It was not communist. It was, of course, a democratic socialist movement. But there certainly were Jews involved in communist organizations as well. And Hitler, of course, took advantage of that, as did leaders of other fascist states and the like. And the allegation that Jews were both, peculiarly bankers and communists at the same time became part of political lore. I think in some senses, in the United States, Jews had a position that enabled them to some extent be exempt from those kinds of criticisms. There were people, of course, who did indeed, make these kinds of accusations. People like, for example, Charles Lindbergh and other German Americans. But I think, Jews in America very quickly transformed from socialism and communism into supporters of, the mainstream Democratic Party. One of the great mysteries of American politics is why we never had a strong socialist movement in the United States compared to most other countries in the world. And I think that to some extent, classic liberalism kind of won the day early in the United States. And that turned out to be something that was good for Jews because it was a system that enabled them to succeed. So I hope I've answered your question about that.
So Steve Cohen asks, what about the Orthodox Jews who tend to be conservative? Why is that?
Okay, well, there are, I appreciate the chance to add some nuance to this. There are two subgroups, broad subgroups within the Jewish community who are less democratic and less liberal on policy issues than the bulk of American Jews. And one of which are those Soviet Jews, ex-Soviet Jews, who came over as adults after 1989. They tended to be fairly Republican, and in large measure because they felt that Ronald Reagan deserved credit for bringing down the Soviet regime. So they were overwhelmingly on the right, as ex-Soviet Jews were also in Israel and probably in every other country where they lived. The difference there is that seems to have been a one-generation phenomenon. Those children of the post-89 Russians who arrived in the U.S. And not just Russians, but other republics, have increasingly become politically indistinguishable from young Jews who were born and raised, who are not Russian, who were born and raised in the United States. So that uniqueness is going to disappear fairly quickly. The other broad category, Orthodox Jewry, and you've of course got two major groups within that category. The modern Orthodox, who the men typically wear cloth kippahs, the women will, if they're observant, wear wigs and so forth. But other than that, are physically indistinguishable from from other Jews in their experiences. And then, of course, you have the ultra-Orthodox world, the Haredim, to use the Israeli phrase, sometimes inaccurately called the Hasidim, but that's a close but not quite exact label for them. And of course, they are divided into sects that hate one another almost as much as they hate what they call secular Jews, which is any Jew who isn't ultra-Orthodox. And the reason for the Orthodox, the modern Orthodox being more Republican and less liberal, would seem to have two bases. One is they perceive the Republican Party to be more pro-Israel than they perceive the Democratic Party. I don't think, in fact, that's accurate when I look at the behavior of regimes and the Israeli government. But there is a perception that somehow the United States is more on the side, Republicans are more on the side of Israel than are the Democrats. And the other factor is that there's a high degree of social conservatism among the modern Orthodox. And they also benefit or would benefit from some of the proposals made by the Republicans since the Christian right has become the driving force that provide government benefits to religious organizations, tuition tax credits and other forms of tangible benefits, which are now being allocated on the basis of religion. The argument is, in a sense, that when the state allocates costs, it cannot put those costs on the religious, but when it allocates benefits, the religious can receive them. It's a very peculiar kind of position. But in any event, I think both Israel and the social conservatism kind of explain the pattern. The ultra-Orthodox are harder to explain because they tend to engage in very kind of communal politics. And oftentimes it's the Rebbe making an arrangement with local politicians. So sometimes the ultra-Orthodox have supported liberal Democrats because those candidates were acceptable to them. Other times they haven't. You really have to talk almost about the specific Rebbe and the specific movement to explain the pattern of behavior. But they are the overwhelming exception to the rule. And pretty much once you control for Orthodox versus non-Orthodox, the partisan gap just becomes very large between those two communities.
So the next question comes from Jeffrey Bigman, and he asks, How do you view the differences of policy toward Israel in a Biden administration? And P.S. Greetings from my daughter, Rebecca, who was a student of yours at UF approximately 14 years ago.
Oh, wow.
I just want to say that I want to just add to that question and say, if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on, why you think it's not accurate to say that Republicans are not necessarily more on the side of Israel than Democrats are.
Yeah. So let me go on sort of where the parties stand on Israel. And I want to stress so that nobody, thinks that I have expertise I don't have. I'm certainly not an expert on foreign policy or international politics. So other people who have better credentials might well disagree with what I've said. I think the perception that the Republicans are better on Israel than the Democrats is actually a fairly recent origin. And it's not been consistent over time because George W. Bush, for example, who famously refused to provide loan guarantees to Israel for building housing to help accommodate the Russians who came in after '89, was perceived as very hostile to Israel. And some Democrats have been perceived as far more open. I think that the conceptualization of Republicans is more supportive than not. I think it, first of all, grows out of, it's contrary to certain facts. It's whether you believe the rhetoric or the behavior. The reality is, for example, the Republican Party in general does not like foreign aid, and Israel, along with Egypt, are the two major recipients of foreign military and domestic aid in the United States. And the Republican Party in Congress has tended to oppose and to reduce foreign aid for decades. This is not a new phenomenon. They don't do it because they want to hurt Israel, but they do it in spite of the fact that that threatens money that the state of Israel wants. So their behavior is not always consistent. The second thing is, I think the current Republican Party is not so much pro-Israel as it is pro-Likud. Likud, of course, supports Israel holding on to the territory it acquired in the Six-Day War, and generally opposes a two-state solution. And ever since Netanyahu came into power, efforts to achieve that two-state solution have been reduced significantly. And that has, of course, continued during the Trump administration. I simply think there are different ways of being pro-Israel. And being pro-Likud is not necessarily being in favor of what many Israelis would consider the best interests of the country. Now, again, it's up to Israelis to make those decisions. But the fact of the matter is, to me, that the behavior is closer. There's another thing that's important. I think it was the head of the Mossad, but I could be wrong. It was somebody very high up in the Israeli government in strategic issues who said that the closest relationship the US and Israel have ever had on strategic grounds was during the Obama administration. Now, Obama did not get along with Benjamin Netanyahu. Lots of people don't get along with Benjamin Netanyahu personally, including his many ex-wives. But that is not the same thing as not being pro-Israel in its orientation. And you have to kind of balance, when you look at the groups that support the parties, do you trust the alt-right on Israel? Do they balance out, the small number of, so-called squad who have said some really stupid things about Israel? So I think the facts it's much more complex than seeing the parties that way. But that is the perception that is out there. The Republicans are more favorable, even though I think it's inaccurate in terms of behavior. So sorry I went on and on, but it's a complex question. And however, I want to make sure people understand my position, even if you disagree with it.
Thank you. Roberta Cooperman, you have a question. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I know it took a second for it to come up. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure we all appreciate it. And you did answer part of my question regarding the religious Jews are primarily for the Republican Party, from what I observed. But another thing that I observed, and I guess it's not with data, growing up, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s, mostly everyone that I knew that were Jewish, and I came from an island, which is, has a large Jewish population, were Democrats. That's what their parents were. That's what the orientation was. However, as my generation didn't experience the kind of discrimination that my parents' generation were more aware of, such as country clubs that didn't allow Jews in, or getting into college. I mean, I never felt that I had a disadvantage because I was Jewish. Maybe coming from New York and Long Island and competing with all the other people that wanted to go to similar schools was my disadvantage demographic, but not religious. And as my generation, I feel, became more affluent versus my parents' generation, given many more advantages that we took for granted, such as college. We didn't go through the things that my parents' generation did. I see and saw more Republican affiliation. And your talk doesn't seem to indicate that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong? I mean, this, again, I don't have data. It's just data.
Okay. Rabbi, maybe we could go to the slides because I have some data. The book is, I've actually had complaints there's too much data in it. But one of the early charts, well, here, all right, here's a simple one. Okay. This is voting patterns among American Jews in presidential elections since 1972, when exit polls were deployed for the first time nationally through 2008. And I would ask you to look at the last two columns, the Democratic share of the two-party vote and the Republican share of the two-party vote. The two-party vote is sometimes it gets rid of small disturbances typically introduced by third-party candidates. Now, if you look at the first 5 elections in this period, you will note that with one exception, the Democratic share of the Jewish vote was 2-1. Okay. Now, keep in mind, this is a period where the Democratic share of the Jewish vote was going down. So this is actually a relatively low point. Jews were still twice as likely to be Democrats as Republicans in this period. Then you get into the 1990s, which is when Jews and others became aware of the role of evangelical Christians in the Republican Party and began to see the recovery of sort of Christian nationalism, the idea of Christian America, and similar kinds of statements emerging from a much more Southern and evangelical Republican Party. And you will notice that at this point, Jews became Democratic supporters by a 3 or 4-to-1 margin, which is much higher. So even when they were moving away from the party in the 70s and 80s, they were still more Democratic than almost any group in the electorate, except for African Americans. And when they came back, they remained and where they are today, the most Democratic of all of all white ethnocultural groups, to put it in that number. Now, I don't have the data for 2012 and 2016 because the exit polls changed their design in those 2 years, and they frankly didn't have enough Jewish respondents to achieve reliable estimates. But there's another slide, which I think is before this one, Rabbi, that shows partisan identification of American Jews since the early 90s. If you can switch that, yeah. So here's partisan identification, and it comes from a question, generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or something else? And these are the reactions of Jews to that question from 1994 to 2016, with later surveys done at the bottom. For some reason, Pew stopped at 2016 using their own data. And what you see was throughout this entire period, the Jewish sense of identification among registered voters is right around 70%. And it remains that way through 2020, where it was exactly 70%. The Republican share of the community is typically between 20 and 30%. It's gone up a little bit in some of those elections, but it's also gone down appreciably in some of those elections as well. So while your impression, I think, is that as Jews became more affluent, they were more likely to become Republican, the fact of the matter is they're still much less Republican than other Americans who have had similar experiences to American Jews. I can assure you that as somebody who grew up in the Nebraska diaspora, as we like to call it, even in our small town, every Jewish family I know, with one exception, was Democratic. And that one exception happened to be my own household, where my father, who was a CPA, identified as Republican. I should point out that before he died, he actually changed his party registration toward independent because as a Holocaust survivor, he became alarmed about trends he saw in the Republican Party, and he moved to an independent status. It turned out my wife had always told my mother had always told her husband that she had voted Republican, but after his death, she told me she'd actually voted a Democratic ticket. So he was outvoted even in our own household. So there's no question that there are, Jewish Republicans. There's no question that there are significant Jewish contributors to the Republican Party. And there have been some Jews who've achieved insider status within Republican administrations. But the fact of the matter is that Jews remain massively disproportionately Democratic, unless you're talking about the Orthodox, who are not anywhere close to being a majority of the American Jewish community. So there you have it. I wonder if I can sort of plant a question, because I think it's really important, is to look at the results from the 2020 presidential election. I don't know the slide number, Rabbi, but it's the first one, and I think it says Jewish voting choices in 2020. Yeah, there we go. Okay. There is a bit of debate going on about how Jews voted in the election that took place in November of 2020. And you see there are two surveys, one by the Republican Jewish Coalition, the other by the Associated Press in the VoteCast project, which show roughly a 2-to-1 Democratic margin in favor margin among Jewish voters, and that the surplus of Democrats over Republicans was about 32% in one and 38% of the other. Now, I should point out, any survey of Jews or any survey of anything is going to have some variation from survey to survey, because there are literally dozens of design features that you have to decide on in doing a survey, and not all of them, are done the same. So you're going to have some differences. But anyway, you have those two surveys, and then on the right side, you had a survey done for the American Jewish Committee by SSRS and by J Street. And these are the funding organizations. The survey was done, the first one by Social Science Research Solutions, and the J Street was done by GBAO, which is Jim Gerstein's shop. And I would stress that both SSRS and GBAO are well known for surveys of the Jewish community. They have an awful lot of experience, whereas NORC, which is a first-rate outfit, has no such history. Neither, as far as I can tell, does Basswood and McLaughlin. I'd never, frankly, heard of Basswood before. But the striking thing is that you see a much higher estimate, a 3-to-1 ratio between Democrats and Republicans among Jews when you look at those two surveys. And it's interesting, that's a difference that is much higher than we've seen. So there's been an interesting debate about, are Jews back to 2-to-1 as they were in the 70s and 80s, or are they, where they have been in the 90s, the aughts, and the 10s at 3-to-1. So let's go to the next slide, which will help shed some light on this. Okay, now this is going to seem a little weedy, and I apologize for that. But these are the questions that the 4 surveys asked when they tried to screen to find Jews. Jews, as you know, are only about 2% of the population. They're about 3% of the electorate because we're an older community, a more affluent and educated community, and a community with extremely high rates of voter registration and turnout. So we're actually more important electorally than in population terms. But you're still looking for, a needle in a haystack when you survey Jews. So RJC and AP had a single question. And if I'll give you a moment to look over the wording of those questions by RJC and the AP. Okay, what you see is those two questions ask the person's religion. In one case, what is your religion or heritage? In the second, what is your present religion, if any? And that's it. If you answer Jewish to that question, you're considered Jewish in those two surveys. If you didn't say you're Jewish, if you picked anything else, including that you have no religious preference, you are not Jewish in the eyes of those surveys. Okay. The AJC and the J Street surveys ask a follow-up question to anybody who answered the initial question, what is your present religion, by giving a different answer, typically saying they had no religious preference or religious affiliation. And the questions are very similar. Do you consider yourself to be Jewish for any reason? Or even though you do not consider your religion to be Jewish, do you consider yourself Jewish? In the American Jewish community, since at least the 1970s, we have data showing that somewhere between a fourth and a third of people of Jewish heritage call themselves Jews when asked question 2, but indicate that they do not have a religion in the first question. And when this was first discovered in the National Jewish Population Survey, this group was called Jews without religion, or Jews with no religion, simply meaning they don't indicate they're Jewish as a religious preference. We know that many of them define themselves as Jewish based on ethnic factors, based on heritage, or based on Jewish culture, and that they have no trouble identifying themselves as Jewish, or in ethnic terms, I should say. But they do not consider themselves religiously observant in that process. And they are not, as I said, they're a quarter to a third, depending upon the survey you use. The LA Times late last year did a survey of Jews, a very good one based on what I've seen. And they found that in Los Angeles, 50% of the people who were Jews by heritage did not pick Jewish as their religious preference. They picked no preference. So they are Jews of no religion. This is part of a movement across religious communities, I should point out. We've seen an explosion of the so-called religious nuns, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, people who say they have no religious preference. They're close to becoming a plurality of the American population. But in the Jewish case, this has been documented going back 40 years now. Okay, so the question is, should they be included if you're trying to talk about the political behavior of American Jews? I would argue at one level there's no correct answer. In fact, I'm tempted to point out halachically, if we go by Jewish law, none of these questions actually get at what makes somebody Jewish. It's birth to a Jewish mother or a Jewish father in the Reform tradition, and not adopting another religion. So halachically, I would argue that the two question screen is better than the one question screen. But the important thing in understanding politics is that we have learned that a person's social identity, the groups with which the person identifies himself or herself, is one of the most powerful predictors of partisanship. And partisanship is the most powerful predictor of voting. People overwhelmingly vote as they describe themselves in partisan terms. So I would argue when you're trying to understand political behavior, which we know is heavily driven by social identity, we need a question about social identity, because simply asking about religion doesn't get at how an increasing proportion of Jews think of themselves Jewishly. And I know for some people this is hard to sort of, wrap your head around. We know that the Jews of no religion, that is to say, who would say no to the RJC or the AP, are systematically different from Jews who identify their religion as Judaism. That is, the Jews of no religion are likely to be younger. They're likely to be less affiliated with any Jewish congregation. If affiliated, they're much more likely to be Reform and much less likely to be Orthodox or conservative. We also know they are disproportionately Democratic. So if you leave them out of a survey, you get a higher proportion of Republican support. If you bring them in, you get what I think is a more accurate assessment of the Jewish community than any other approach to the tradition. So my evidence, the evidence I tend to believe by the surveys that I think know how to survey Jews, is that the AJC survey and the J Street survey, which showed a 3-to-1 margin among Jews, is more accurate than the surveys which showed a 2-to-1 relationship. And I should point out, even 2-to-1 makes Jews super Democrats. I don't want to imply that this is a bigger difference than it is. But I think those two surveys both overestimate the Republican vote among Jews. The RJC has a reason, I think, for wanting that, because they have to show donors that it's worth contributing to Republicans. The AP, I think, simply because they're doing lots of surveys and they need to get them done quickly, doesn't really have the time or the inclination to ask a follow-up for Jews. And indeed, I got that from a person who works at NORC, who does the AP poll, who used to work for SSRS. And he acknowledged to me that he thinks their Jewish sample is not representative of the Jewish community in a broad sense of the term. So I had to get that in because I'm working on an article about this, and it's been what's obsessing me of late. So.
Okay, we have another question, two more questions, but I want to make sure we have a chance to just talk about yesterday and your take on it. Maybe, I don't know, I think can people nod? Do you feel like you'd like to hear a little bit about, yes. So could you talk a little bit about yesterday? I don't even know what the right question is to ask, frankly. Yeah. I think a lot of us probably feel a little speechless, but hopefully you don't. And we look forward to hearing you talk about it. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wish I could tell you something that you probably won't hear elsewhere. I'm not sure I've processed it enough to have a really original sense. I think in retrospect, if we just talk about, whether you call it an insurrection or a riot or, an attempt to take over Congress, I do think in retrospect, it now appears even more predictable than I think I thought it would be. I do monitor social media, and there were calls for things of this nature. But even so, I was surprised, and I was surprised at how poorly planned the official response was with law enforcement. And I think, like many people, what grabs at me most is asking what would have happened again had those people been people of color. And again, I think we should remember back, in May, I think it was, an armed militia invaded the State House in Michigan. Those of you from the Lansing congregation, I'm sure, remember that very well. And the striking thing is that law enforcement apparently did not use its weaponry to keep people out. Even yesterday, when they herded, apparently, a lot of the people who had been in the house, even when they herded them together, they had about 50 people at one point in one of the lobbies, they let them go. They didn't arrest them. So I think those people who claim there's no systematic racism in the United States, I think, have a lot of explaining to do, given the nature of law enforcement. Now, I'm happy there was no bloodshed. But again, I do worry what that seems to suggest to other people is that you can do this sort of thing without any retribution. I appreciate the people who are calling for an immediate impeachment of Donald Trump, which I don't see as politically plausible. And I'm just, like many people, like I did, in '74 with Nixon, when Nixon resigned. Or not '74, I guess it was '75. I'm really hoping that the military is set up a system of countersigning commands so that nothing is done without, quadruple checking, and that if they do check, it's with Pence rather than President Trump. But I think the implications, people, when something like this happens, things of this magnitude, people always say things will never be the same. People will now, be different because of what happened. And I guess I have to say, I don't believe that. I saw the reaction to 9/11, and temporarily it produced a sense of national unity, but it didn't last long. And I think that's true of most events. So I don't think that the views of the large movement which supported Trump is likely to change. I think it is profoundly anti-democratic in its orientation, which should not surprise anybody because the data have shown that kind of sentiment to be broad in scope. And like everybody else, I'm keeping my fingers crossed for the next 10 days and hope that we will get through that without further violence. But it's it's a sobering thing. I've worried about American democracy a lot the last couple of years, and in a way was happy I wasn't teaching, because it would be hard to talk about this without sounding partisan. And I try very hard not to do that. When I make statements, I try to have data behind them. But I'm glad I don't have to face a class full of students and try to tell them this is what's going to happen. So that's the best I can give you.
So I see Lou Hecht has a question. So I'm going to let Lou.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. My comment that I made in the chat room, I'll just repeat it. My perception of the Christian white evangelicals is that they are, I'd call them closet bigots and white supremacists. And certainly, if you scratch them hard enough, anti-Semites. I base this on my reading of a lot of background articles on the evangelical community that the New York Times has published and other places, Atlantic magazine as well. Your comments about that?
Okay. Well, as someone who studies religion and politics, I always joke that I owe my career to the Ayatollah Khomeini and Jerry Falwell, because when I expressed to my dissertation supervisor my interest in studying religion and politics in the US, he told me that it was a terrible decision strategically. Nobody was interested. Religion had once mattered in American politics. It didn't matter anymore. And that essentially nobody would be interested in reading anything that I wrote. And he was probably right. I should point out he was a person of faith, so he wasn't a militant secularist who objected to this. He was fascinated by the work I was doing, even if he thought it was strategically a bad idea. And in a sense, what enabled me to have a career was the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East, unfortunately. But also the rise of Christian conservatism in the United States. Evangelicals have been there forever, but they only really became politically mobilized in the 1970s and 80s as part of, again, the Republican effort to rebuild the party's strength. And I realized that, having been raised in a Jewish environment and in the Midwest where there weren't a lot of evangelicals, everybody else was kind of there were a lot of mainline Protestants, but not very many evangelicals. I didn't really know this community very well. So one of my first research projects involved a lot of visitation, a lot of observation. Technically, it was participant observation, but I wasn't praying with them, but I was at services. I was at adult Sunday school, which usually precedes services. I would be at coffee afterwards and spent a lot of time hanging around evangelical congregations, sufficiently such that my rabbi at one point worried about my soul with all of this. I never told him that when I was in Boy Scouts, because we didn't have enough Jews in Lincoln, Nebraska to have a troop, I was actually assigned to the local Catholic parish. So I went through a Catholic Boy Scout training and then hung around with all these evangelicals. And the thing I have to say about evangelicals is there are evangelicals and there are evangelicals. They're not all the same. And of course, I don't assume you think that. But there's a lot of diversity within the evangelical world. And a lot of the scholars with whom I worked early on were themselves evangelicals. They mostly came from the Reformed tradition rather than, say, the Southern Baptist tradition, which is more experiential. And these are well-trained, first-rate scholars who I believe don't have, a bigoted bone in their body. And in that experience, I met lots of evangelicals who I would characterize as good people. They'd probably be great neighbors if you needed help. I'm sure privately they worried about my soul, but I didn't sense that they were either very politically engaged, nor that they were particularly anti-Semitic. I was often, again, the first Jew they met, this being Nebraska. There are, I think, within all religious traditions, and this is the one thing I have learned in a career spent studying religion and politics, every religious tradition that has survived for thousands of years has within it the resources that could support virtually any political position you would like to take. That is, you can construct from aspects of a tradition a variety of political positions and claim this is the quote unquote authentic Jewish position or Baptist position or Catholic position. But the reality is you can support virtually anything you want given the diversity of those traditions. To me, the real question is who interprets the religion? Because most of us don't sit and confront our religious tradition when we're trying to formulate our political ideas. We tend to accept the interpretations that are given by religious leaders and others. And there's no question that evangelicalism has within it elements that can support racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and has done so at various times. And I think a lot of it was the fact that evangelicalism became culturally part of the American South. There are plenty of evangelicals outside the South, but typically what happened in the 1860s is that Baptists, Methodists, and other religious groups split regionally over slavery. And the Southern Baptist Convention was basically formed by white Southerners who supported slavery. And that was true of some of these other traditions as well. And certainly the bulk of people saw segregation as godly and ordained and the like. And that tradition is there, and I think many Southern evangelicals have understood it. Similarly, anti-Semitism was an important element in that tradition, although I would argue that among evangelicals, anti-Catholicism was actually much more prevalent than anti-Semitism in the like. So the tradition is there, and people do draw on those things. But I would not characterize the whole tradition as being in that one direction. I've met evangelicals who are extraordinarily progressive, who work hard to achieve social justice, who work hard to support Black Lives Matter movements, and who are non-anti-Semitic. Sometimes they're philo-Semitic, and again they identify supporting Jews. They point to biblical passages about whoever supports the Jews will be blessed. So I do think one has to be a little nuanced about this. Yes, on average, evangelical Protestants, particularly white evangelical Protestants, do exhibit those traits you've talked about, but they exhibit it in varying degrees, and it differs from person to person. I worry much more about those evangelicals who are Christian nationalists, who believe the U.S. is a Christian nation, even though the only words in the Constitution about religion when it was passed were negative. The word simply said that there should be no religious tests for holding political office in the United States. And certainly there were evangelicals who wanted the Constitution changed, who came up with actually a new preface to the Constitution, which acknowledged Jesus Christ as the founder of the United States. But those things got nowhere. So, but I do worry about the politicized evangelicals who somehow see the Republican Party and Trump as, the expression of God's ordained will. That strikes me as quite dangerous. So
I want to be, aware of time, but I'm hoping we can do like one more speed round of a question or two. I have the questions that were asked in the chat box. So okay. One question, and maybe you can just kind of like answer them all together, even though they don't go together. But one question was essentially, with every generation of like with the Russian Jews, or we see this for us, and for those of us who live in Port Washington, right near us is Great Neck, and there's a large Persian Jewish community there, which tends to be more conservative. But with with subsequent with subsequent generations, they seem to be less conservative and more liberal. So the question was really like, do you see a shift, in like the Russian community or the Persian community from conservative to less conservative or more liberal with every generation post immigration? And then the other two questions were, and I realized there's one of you I'm just not getting to. One was, do we know how the Orthodox community community's participation in the electoral process compares to the rest of the Jewish community? You might have already covered that. One was, can you talk about the disproportionate number of Jews in the Senate and the fact that they're from both parties? Why do you think that is? And then the last one was kind of fun maybe, but will the fact that the vice president's husband, the vice president-elect's husband, that he's Jewish, have any impact on citizens?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think the impact of Kamala Harris, whose kids, as many of you probably know, call her Mamala, as their joke, her stepchildren, who are very close to her apparently. I think that effect is actually, her effect is going to be much more profound on Americans of South Indian background. And I said this 6 months ago before everybody discovered it, and it had an enormous impact on contributions to the Democratic Party. I think it will just, it's interesting though, you think about it. I always ask my students a question, or any group I lecture to, going back to 2016, and said of the three candidates who were in the nomination contest near the end of the 2016 nominating season, which one did not have a Jewish grandchild? And the correct answer is Bernie Sanders, who apparently, whose son does not apparently identify as Jewish, and as far as I know, I don't know what the son has kid, but does not have a Jewish grandchild. Both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton had Jewish grandchildren. And again, how Hillary Clinton's grandchildren are being raised, I'm not sure, but I have the sense they're being raised, at least exposed to Judaism in this regard. So I don't think the vice president's spouse is going to matter, but I do think there is a kind of general perception that Jews are heavily Democratic. And I should point out that we just got data yesterday from the Pew Research Center. There are, I think, 32 Jewish members of Congress, either Jewishly identified or of Jewish background. Of those 32, 30 are Democrats. And the two Republicans are both members of the House from New York. One from Long Island, I think actually one from, the place where all the cops live. I should know this, in New York.
Massapequa?
No, the place on the ferry,
Staten Island?
Staten Island, yeah. I think one of them now is somebody who represents Staten Island.
Stefanik, I think.
Yeah, no, she's not Jewish actually.
Okay.
There were two guys, but the seat there was taken from a Jewish Democrat who won it in 2018. And the other one is I don't remember where he's from, but any event, no, and that's been fairly typical. There are no Jewishly identified senators and only two in the House. And now actually I have to take it back. There's one more with, assuming the Republicans choose to seat John Ossoff, which is what's keeping me up at night. I'm really curious if yesterday's events are going to make them less prone to challenge John Ossoff's election. They don't need to go after Warnock, both because his margin was bigger and because he only put them at 50-49. But if they'll go after anybody, they'll go after Ossoff, and it wouldn't shock me. I'll just put it that way. So Jews are, again, the voting patterns suggest overwhelmingly Democratic. And among Jews elected to public office, Jews have been overwhelmingly Democratic in both the Senate and the House and Supreme Court nominations over time. So that doesn't change. Which questions didn't I answer of that?
I think the Orthodox Jew one, was that, or did that?
Well, yeah,
kind of got answered.
Yeah, that's just the bottom line is they are more Republican and more conservative. And we know that with more confidence among the modern Orthodox because they're more likely to participate in surveys We infer it from geographic patterns in the case of the ultra-Orthodox, who are typically less likely to talk to survey researchers. But yes, they do, and it varies. They're not 90% Republican. They're not as Republican as other Jews or Democratic, but they have on occasion voted majority for Republican candidates for particular offices.
So I want to thank you so much for your time and for being with us. I want to remind everyone that Professor Ken Wald's book is called, newest book is called The Foundation of American Jewish Liberalism. I put the link for it in our chat box, and I will also send it to you by email. And I hope that you will take a look at it. I know a couple of you already purchased it and said that you thought it was great. So I see some people are applauding. We are incredibly grateful to you, Professor, in this interesting time in American history and politics. To hear someone just explain why things are the way they are, I think gives all of us kind of a little extra breath of fresh air when we're really needing it right now. So, so thank you so much for your time. I want to remind people that our next Thursday Lunch and Learn is February 4th. We'll be having author, on a totally different kind of note, we'll be having author Esther Safran Foer, who wrote the book, I Want You to Know We're Still Here. And her book is a memoir about looking for family that that she didn't even know existed back in the country, in the shtetl, the places where her family came from. And it's absolutely fascinating. You can buy it on Amazon, get it in your local bookstore, take it out from your library. I've been listening to it on audiobook, and it's super interesting. So thank you again, Professor, for your time. Friends, we are happy to see you. We pray for the health and the well-being of our country, and stay strong. So
can I say two quick things?
Yes.
First, I want to shout out to friends in Ormond Beach who I didn't know were going to be on the call. The late Cy Weiner was a good friend of mine, and he had me down a couple of times to speak to that congregation. So it's good to connect. The other thing is I'm not as different from Ms. Foer, as you suggest. My parents were both Holocaust survivors, and my grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. And I have a memoir that I'm trying to sell to a publisher at this point. So at some point you want another talk from a second generation about the experience. Since I'm working on that, I'm happy to chat about that as well. But anyway, thank you very much.
Sign us up. And I can say I've been getting private messages from different people saying how much they enjoyed your talk. So, good. Really, thank you so much. All right, friends, be well. We'll see you soon. An early Shabbat Shalom to all of you.